Hello and a warm welcome from my side. My name is Henning Schöpper, and today I'm presenting our work using natural language processing for supply chain mapping, systematic review of current approaches. But before I start, I want to very briefly introduce our background. So me and my co-author, we both work at the Hamburg University of Technology with its slogan, Technology for People. The university was initially founded in 1978, purely as a research university, but started lectures shortly after. And as German standards go, we are a pretty small and young university. But yeah, as I like to say, this has also sometimes its advantages in terms of flexibility and speed. With no further ado, let's start with the presentation of today. And I've split my presentation into 4 parts. First, I want to start with a motivation and problem statement, go to the methodology, and then to the results. And finally, provide a conclusion and discussion. As we all remember that beginning of last year, the COVID-19 wave hit, and I think it was around mid-February when this initially arose in China. And there's an interesting article I brought with me today from the Wall Street Journal. It states that coronavirus created the domino effect in global automotive supply chains. And what I found interesting about this article is that it shows that the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on global supply chains were not limited to one company, one country or facility, but these were really global effects. And they were not only global, they were also very serious. And if you think about this, these are big companies with huge resources. And if these companies run into trouble, then there is an issue at hand. And what this issue is, and if we dig into this, I've brought with me another article which I think broke it down to the point that the vast majority of the companies do not have or do not know about their risk exposure or knew about their risk exposure they had at that time in Asia. And yeah, why is that the case? And if we dig deeper into that, we see that many companies, even big companies, what they do know is they do know about their first tier suppliers or their direct suppliers. They know these companies pretty well. But if you go beyond that and say, okay, what are the suppliers of the suppliers? What are their suppliers? Then this kind of structural information is very limited for even those big companies. And yeah, that is a serious problem if you think about it from a risk perspective. And the question remains, what can we do about this? And we and others propose that companies should do something like supply chain mapping. So what is supply chain mapping? Supply chain mapping is a process where you visualize and acquire data and visualize it so that you can see how the goods, information, and money flow from an upstream and in the downstream direction and through a firm. And to give you, let's say, an idea of this, what this may look like, so there are very different approaches to this, but I brought with me the network structure model from Couple from 2019. And what's nice about this is one approach in the literature, how to map a supply chain. And what's nice about this is that you actually can see that there are two dimensions to supply chain mapping. So for one, there's this vertical aspect, as I mentioned previously. So when we talk about suppliers and customers, then we say, okay, this is vertical supply chain mapping. And if we talk about, for example, competitors, complementers, so cooperative or competitive relations, then we talk about horizontal supply chain mapping. Yeah, basically, if supply chain mapping is the solution, then you could ask me now, okay, Henning, are you finished? Because then every company should do supply chain mapping and we are all fine. Unfortunately, there remains some practical implementation barriers to this approach. And there are mainly three of these barriers, and I will emphasize two on which so in my focus and in our work on which we focus. This is the thing that this approach, so supply chain mapping in general, requires a high effort, which means that often there were interview studies, empirical studies done in order to get the relevant supply chain information. But even let's say if companies are willingly to make that decision, then there's still the question of the availability of data. And the problem is that in global supply chains we have a transparency issue, and this means that companies do not easily share information about their own supply chain, if they have any, to others. So there is no from internal data or from company data, there is a fundamental transparency barrier for this approach, which is the main motivation for our work. And then the last one, of course, is also there's lack of standardization. So we see that here is a network model, but generally the approach of supply chain mapping, it's not so standardized as one would like. But the problem with the data is really the issue at hand. And yeah, what's the idea if we think about this from a conceptual perspective? Then the idea is that we do not use direct supply chain data, but we use secondary sources. For example, we use unstructured and semi-structured data, such as news articles or blog posts, or even social media posts are thinkable because we suppose that these data types, so these sources, do contain valuable supplier, customer, and competitor, for example, information. And so what we suppose is, or what we propose is, that there is really a case here, and we mean a case for using NLP methods in order to extract supply chain information from these sources. And of course, in the end, provide the user with a supply chain map, which could used, for example, we think about three main areas of application. So first, the risk management, as I mentioned earlier, so preventing pandemics like COVID-19 to actually affect your own supply chain efficiency, optimize your supply chain, or even sustainability. So if you think about that, customers today increasingly want to know where the products come from, and hold companies accountable if there are violations in social standards in the supply chain. But the application area is not so. This is not something we concern ourselves with, but we try to focus on the approach itself. And there are basically three parts of our research, but I will today only present you the first, which is the identification and evaluation of current approaches, because this is not completely new. So there have been works on that problem, and so we want to look into this. But as currently they're working on two other parts, the conceptualization phase and an additional case study. So maybe next year I will be presenting the last two parts of this. We framed basically three research questions. The first is the question, what approaches exist? The second is, how can these approaches be compared and evaluated? And the last is, what are the limitations of these approaches? Jumping into the methodology, we used a systematic literature study. For those of you who do not know this method exactly, I will just very briefly go over this. So it has distinct stages. There are different methodologies. We used one from ARCSI and LIVAC, which proposed that there are 5 steps. So identification of the research questions, study identification, selection, the charting of data, and the reporting. And yeah, the research question, I already showed you this, so I will skip over this and jump to the identification, where we used basically search terms, as seen here on the slide, and applied these to databases, Scopus and Web of Science, which are meta databases, and I think everyone knows Google Scholar, of course. Here we can see the selection process, and this is a so-called Prisma flowchart, which is a standard way of reporting this kind of how did we drill down the initial amount of initial studies. As you can see here, we have identified roughly 390 publications, and this is the process on how we drilled these publications down with title abstract screening and a full text screening afterwards. And yeah, we finally arrived with 12 records, which we deemed relevant for analysis. Which brings me to the results. And I will start with a tabular form of what publications we identified. And if you look very closely, then the first thing which comes to the eye is that we actually see that there are two, on the timeline, that there are two clusters. So one, so roughly around 2010, and one which concerns with itself, it's newer, so one newer cluster of research interest. And what's also mentionable is that most of the or the majority of the publications are conference journals, conference articles. So these, in my opinion, emphasizes the prematurity of the research field. When we look at the timeline here, what we initially thought is that it could be an interesting perspective to show, are these publications somehow clustered? And in order to do that, we analyzed the so-called BBU Graphic Coupling, which is that if you compare the references lists of two publications and these match closely, then you can say they are bibliographically coupled. There are advantages and disadvantages to this method. On the plus side, because the bibliographic coupling is backward looking in time, it's basically fixed and static, so newer publications do not change the results in any way. And what we can see here is, I think, a very interesting result. What we can see is here that we basically have two clusters of research interest. One, as we already have seen it visually as we could visually obtain it from the table, we see here that roughly around 2010 we have a research cluster And then we have another research cluster, which is of a more recent nature, with one exception, of course, which is BAO from 2008. But yeah, this is the overall big picture, I would say. And when we jump to the key facts, what we can conclude from this is that the research overall is pretty fragmented overall. So we have different research clusters, and even in these research clusters, when you look at cluster B, the publications are only weakly coupled in itself. And what that means is that these works actually not have a common knowledge base. So there are no distinct publication which we can say this is the scientific basis for doing this. So there are different areas, there are different research fields, and everyone is addressing these, but in a slightly different way. And so we think this is a pretty strong case for actually looking at this and say, okay, is there a way to summarize and to actually to classify or develop a taxonomy of some kind to actually bring all this together if it's fragmented like this. And yeah, what we came up with is that if you remember from the first slides, that we distinguished basically between horizontal and vertical mapping. And if you take this and you analyze the content of the papers, then you can see that there's generally the thing that, so we found only one paper which is actually doing horizontal and vertical mapping at the same time. So they are basically either doing the one or the other. And what you also can see is that there are so-called content-based approaches, which are approaches that, when you think about relations between companies, let's say you want to know about a supply relationship between two companies, then there are basically two approaches which are used in the literature. One is that there's a look at the content of, let's say, the news article, for example. So look at the content at the word level or the sentence level. But on the other hand, there are also approaches which try to link these news articles together, or link companies together, and based on the linkages between them, they are actually try to develop information about relations. And so these have to be distinguished. And the last one is how are these relations identified? And there are in our opinion, there are basically two. And this is rule-based approaches. These are classic rules are applied. Linguistic rules are applied, for example, to provide this. And there are supervised learning approaches to obtain this relation. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at these three, you can see that in newer times, we have a tendency for more vertical, content-based, and supervised approaches. And yeah, this is we think this is quite interesting. So this is the general picture. This is the development, how this field goes, and we this matches also with recent developments in natural language processing and machine learning, that we see more supervised approaches in recent times. And now if we switch our perspective a bit, we see that there are only three publications which address all these aspects at once, but neither of them is actually addressing, as I mentioned earlier, horizontal and vertical mapping approaches at the same time, which we suppose is currently, basically the main limitations of the current approaches. There are other methodological limitations which I had to skip because that would have gotten out of hand in the context of this presentation. For that, I will I refer you to the paper where we digged into the publications itself and uncovered also many methodological shortcomings in the individual publications. So, coming to the conclusion and the discussion, I will briefly summarize what we talked about today. First, we presented, to the best of our knowledge, we presented the first work which summarized and evaluated NLP-based mapping approach, supply chain mapping approaches with a systematic literature review. We have shown that the research field is in an early stage and it's fragmented. And so we proposed a taxonomy in order to classify the approaches in these three categories I mentioned before. And newer works show a tendency, in our opinion, towards content-based vertical supply chain mapping approaches with supervised learning techniques. And what we derived from the research is that there currently is no integration between the horizontal and vertical mapping, which we suggest is a topic for further research. And also, as I mentioned before, the approaches show methodological shortcomings, which I could not address fully in this presentation, but which are addressed in our paper. So, coming to an end, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm glad if you have any questions.